And kids, kindergarten through second grade, if you want to head with Mr. Patrick and Miss Amber to story time. Other kids, you want to grab one of the activity sheets that says True Greatness on it. That's the one for today. And if this was an episode of Sesame Street, if you couldn't tell, our key word for today is great. So we're thinking about what it means to be great. And in all of us, there's something that desires to be great or to be associated with greatness. And just think about even that term, great. You look out history and we have characters like it's not just Alexander, it's Alexander the Great. It's not Catherine, it's Catherine the Great. Or it was no ordinary depression, it was the Great Depression or the Great Awakening. And you go all throughout the world, and this is not an ordinary wall in China, it is the Great Wall of China. And you have the Great Pyramids, and those of you who are from the Midwest, these aren't normal plains, these are the Great Plains. And for all our Minnesotans, I mean, you come down to Florida and we have lakes, but what you have the Great Lakes. And we're talking about size, scale, magnitude, or you go into sports. Several years ago when our girls were a lot younger, some of their little friends in one of their classes, it was the boys, they were having an argument about who was the GOAT. And they were calling this one person the GOAT, and somebody else was arguing and said, no, he's the GOAT. And they got a little offended and said, you shouldn't say things like that to people. That's not kind to call people GOATs. And I said, well, it's an acronym for the greatest of all time. And we even have it like in entertainment, like you have someone known as the greatest showman who put on the greatest show on earth. And even if you don't want to travel to see it, I mean, you can sit in your living room and you can read The Great Gatsby during the commercials of the Great British Bake Off. So we just have greatness everywhere. And if you think even of your own personal life, I mean, I want a great life. I would love to have a great family, a great job, be a part of a great church. And even the disciples on the way to Jerusalem, as they were traveling to Jerusalem, Jesus is going, in essence, to the final week of his life, and they were arguing on the trip. And do you remember what they were arguing about? Which one of us is going to be the greatest when he comes into his kingdom? And the way we kind of measure greatness, I mean, it's size, it's scale, it's magnitude, it's visibility, it's influence, it's admiration. But when we use the word great for everything from empires to hamburgers, from athletes to vacations, from moments that last forever to moments that are gone in a moment, we think, all right, well, what makes something truly great? And when we come to Acts chapter 4, we're going to be in Acts 4 and 5 again, because one of the things that Luke does when he's setting up the church, he gives you a picture, and in the first couple of chapters, he's going to paint a picture almost as creation restored. When the Spirit comes and it redeems the people, and for these brief glimpses, we get glimpses of glory. How we were meant to be in those small moments where it's like everything is right in the world. And in this section, he's going to tell us what marked that moment in time for them as their ministry was marked by great power. They had great grace. And then in chapter 5, a great fear. So one of the things he's going to run through Acts, he's going to shape our thinking of what does it mean to be great. He's going to show us a couple different kinds. But the greatness that's produced here is greatness when Christ is truly present among his people. So let's unpack a couple of these. Let's look first at great power. When Christ is proclaimed, there is great power. And the congregation of those who believed were of one heart and soul. And not one of them, starting chapter 4, verse 32, not one of them was saying that any of his possessions was his own, but for them everything was in common. And with great power, the apostles were bearing witness to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. And great grace was on them all. For there was not a needy person among them. For all who were owners of land and houses would sell them and bring the proceeds of the sales and lay them at the feet of the apostles, and they would be distributed to each as they had a need. Now Joseph, a Levite of Cyprian birth, who was also called Barnabas by the apostles, which translated means the son of encouragement, and who owned a field. He sold it and he brought the money and he laid it at the apostles' feet. So the first thing we see about greatness is we see when there is great power. With great power, the apostles were giving their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord. And notice what Luke emphasizes here. It's not the great personalities of the apostles. It's not the great strategies of the apostles. It's not the great creativity of the apostles. It's their powerful word. It's the word of testimony. They were proclaiming a risen Christ, and with that came the power. And this is one of the central truths in Acts, that the power is not inherent in the person or even the method. The power comes by the proclamation of the risen Son through the descended Spirit. So we saw that in Acts 2. The Spirit comes down, the word is preached, and the kingdom is made visible, and it advances. Word and Spirit, they're always united. So even in this little vignette, what we see is what makes a church great. It's not necessarily how creative it is, how impressive it is. A church is great when Christ is clearly, faithfully, boldly proclaimed as risen. And when Christ is proclaimed as risen, that's where there is power. Power to convict, power to awaken, power to transform. And if you think about your life, what's so often needed in so many of our lives is, in essence, not more information, but it's more power. You think about things where we're, in one sense, we want to be better parents, or we want to overcome sin in our life, or we want to fix certain things. But if you do it with the wrong source of power, it just makes things really hard. Yesterday, we were with a couple of my children. We made the unfortunate mistake of trying to get gas at Sam's at noon. So we sat in line for about 30 minutes, almost ran out of gas at the gas station. And there was a pump that was empty, and it was just diesel. There was a diesel thing, and the boys could not conceptualize why I did not scoot in there and get the diesel. They just thought I was just being so neglectful or foolish. But there's an empty pump right there. Why don't you use it? Well, that's not going to fuel us in how we need to be fueled. And so if you look, there's certain things in your life where it might not fuel you in how you need to be fueled. This came starkly clear years ago. I was watching a fascinating back and forth interview. It was when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State. And they had just rolled out, it was going to be one of the largest humanitarian initiatives to Africa. And what we were trying to tackle and help was, at the time, it was in the midst of the AIDS, in essence, pandemic AIDS crisis in sub-Saharan Africa. And the initiative that they were unveiling was, in essence, the largest sex education program that had ever been initiated. And they had one of the representatives, I can't remember what country it was from, I think it was Sudan, but one of their representatives was kind of there to be the token recipient of this massive, hundreds of $1 million initiative. And he was very kind, he was respectful, he was grateful. He said, thank you, Madam Secretary, for taking a concern for this plague that's paralyzing our continent. But he said, I don't remember how he framed it, but it was in essence, to be honest, what we don't need education. He says, we know where it comes from, and we know how to stop it. He says, what we don't have is power. We don't have power to break it. And he was a believer and said, we don't have power to break the sin that has captured us. What we actually need is power. And here what comes when Christ is proclaimed and there's resurrection power. And there's just certain things in life where we don't need more instructions. What we need is more power. And that power comes when Christ is not just kind of trying to help you with your life, but he enters it in. He centers it. Christ doesn't just speak through his church. He works through them with power. So that's the first thing. There was great power connected to the word. But then it says there was great grace upon them all. So when Christ is proclaimed, there's power. But when Christ provides, there is great grace. I love that phrase, great grace was upon them all. Now the focus shifts, and he gives the shift is from what they were proclaiming to how they were living, their community. And notice there's 3 marks of this great grace. Do you see in 32 and 33? They were all of one heart and one soul. So incredible unity. No one said that any of the things that belonged to them were their own. And then there was not a needy person among them. So this is not forced compliance. It's not manufactured. It's organic, but it grows from what Christ is given. He's supplying something to his people that makes them settled, makes them generous, makes them open. He's reshaping their hearts, and he's loosening the grip that they have on things so they can be more generous, gracious towards one another, and generous with what they have. And then notice he kind of gives us a case study of a person who's going to embody it. In essence, what is one of the things on the front of your bulletin, our desire here is to be a grace-saturated church, a church that the environment, the culture, the aroma is one that's just gracious. And what does that look like? Well, here we get Barnabas, who in essence is a grace-saturated culture embodied. He's the embodiment of it. We get an example. And if we have our discipleship hour classes, and in our deep dive, we're going to take a deep dive into Barnabas and his character. But you see what he does. He sells a field. He brings the money. He lays it at the apostles' feet. But notice there's no real spotlight. There's no announcement. There's no press release. Grace has satisfied him, and then he freely gives and lets it go. You're talking about the debate over who's the GOAT. I think there's no debate when you're talking about basketball. Now, I grew up as a Michael Jordan fan, so he is the undisputed GOAT, greatest of all time. But one of my sadnesses as I looked up to him as an icon was heard about his Hall of Fame speech, and he had something he was trying to do in the Hall of Fame speech, but it didn't really come out kind of the way he had hoped, because it came out as somewhat vindictive, because he kind of named every person in his entire life, going back to like preschool, who had not believed in him. And he was like, yeah, you see. But his goal was to try and say, you motivated me to be better, but it didn't come out that way. It came out as small and vindictive, and and things like that. The classic thing is, be brief, be grateful, and then be seated. But there was another speech at the same time. David Robinson also had a Hall of Fame speech, and his gets lost. But it was so beautiful because he was celebrated for how open-handed and how generous he was. The person who introduced him talked about how he was one of the most open-handed and generous people he had ever met in his life. David Robinson is a strong believer. And when he got up to set up his speech, he says, well, the reason why I could be so open-handed in essence, he goes, I found that if you cling to the things you own so tightly, you won't have any ability to hold those you love. So he said, that's why I was open-handed. And this is exactly what's happening here. I mean, you have the example of Barnabas, who's so open-handed, because in this context, it's money, it's the possessions we have. And if we cling to those so tightly, what we're actually clinging to is we're clinging to the security they can give, the control they can give, the identity that they can give. That's why that kind of open-handed generosity can feel so threatening. Sometimes we only give when it feels safe, or only serve when it's going to be noticed, or only love when it's going to be reciprocated. Because underneath all of that is a fear that if I let go and I'm open myself up, I won't be okay. I could be attacked. But here Barnabas is someone he could let go because the risen Christ was already enough. He already had all he needed. And until Christ becomes your security, you're always going to cling to something. Until he becomes your treasure, you're always going to cling to something. And I don't want to pass over too quickly, I think maybe the greatest miracle of this entire chapter. We've seen miracles already where, a man lame for 40 years is leaping. But maybe the greatest miracle of this whole section is that line where it says in 34, "For there was not a needy person among them." I want you to notice something about that. Can you imagine what would it be like to live in a context where there was not a single needy person? Now, initially, when you first read this, you think, well, it's a statement about resources, where they pooled what they had, they redistributed, the poor got fed, and the lack got supplied, and that's true, but I don't think that's all that was what's going on. I don't think that's the whole picture. Luke's already told us that great grace was upon them all, and then he describes an incredible moment of complete contentment in a community. I think this is what community contentment looks like. It's more than just a balanced budget. It's the grace of contentment. I don't think there was an overabundance of resources. I think there was an overabundance of contentment. You don't need a whole lot when you already have everything. And for them, the risen Christ became everything. Spurgeon loved to tell the story of Spurgeon, one of the great Victorian pastors. The Metropolitan Tabernacle was in South London at the time. That was the poorest section of all of London. And he would go visit some of the parishioners, and one of his favorite, he would come in, and the man would insist, even though it was one of the poorest sections in London, he would insist on feeding him some tea and bread. And they'd sit down, and it'd be old, stale, moldy bread. And the man would go to bless the food, and he'd just smile, and he'd say, "All this and Jesus too. All this and Jesus too. Can you believe it?" Now, we live in a world where we could say better than almost anybody who's ever existed, all this and Jesus too. And if you can't say Jesus too, it doesn't matter how much all this you got, it's not going to satisfy. There'll always be a hole. And so let's think about, what does it mean that there's no needy person? Because there's a good kind of need. There's a need of immaturity. There's a need of childishness. And in one sense, all of us are needy because we're weak, broken individuals. So there's a good type of need. But we all know there's also a selfish type of need. There's a soul-sucking, kind of community-destroying type of need. And what would it be like to live in that type of community where there was no needy person among you? Let's be honest, when I said there was no needy person, probably 90% of you thought of someone. So you have someone who you're thinking of as being excessively needy. So the type of neediness I'm talking about is not the kind that's just normal with living. But what type of neediness can grace dissipate or destroy? There's a type of emotional neediness. I mean, some people need people to affirm them. They need their spouse to always notice every dish they clean. They need their kids to appreciate them every meal they buy. They need their boss to validate them whenever they arrive on time. And if those things don't come, they can just come undone, become anxious, become resentful. They can withdraw and pout. Why? Because somewhere along the way, they're using people to carry a weight for their soul that only Christ can really carry. We can kind of break it down, and there's types of kind of validation-driven neediness, where we just need regular assurance. Going through the world, am I okay? Am I doing okay? And those people can be so easily discouraged, so easily destabilized. They can read a neutral situation as some type of negative, slight, or offense, and they require ongoing emotional management. What that creates in the people around them is just exhaustion and the uneven relationships of always giving but never receiving, kind of validation-driven neediness. There's a type of attention-centered neediness. And I mean, every 4-year-old boy grows up with this, where they interrupt the whole world and say, look at me, listen to me, watch me. But eventually you want to grow out of that. So you're not the 40-year-old boy still demanding the world, look at me, celebrate me, watch me. And somehow conversations always drift back to them. Their struggles dominate every space, and they have a real hard time celebrating anything good that happens to anyone else. So there's an attention-centered neediness. There's a type of relational destructive neediness where some people create needs and don't even realize it. They create messes that are then required for other people to constantly go behind and clean up. So they can cut people with careless words or criticize and dominate conversations and lack awareness of how they're impacting others, and they can leave behind them confusion and hurt and tension, and somebody has to constantly go behind and say, oh, well, he didn't really mean that. And you think about the neediness. One of the things we're trying to help institute in our household is things would just go so much smoother if you just cleaned up after yourself. You don't have to clean up after your sibling. If you just cleaned up after yourself, things would be so much smoother. And you go through life where not just being needy, but you don't just have needs, but you create needs for all those around you that others have to repair and clarify. Or sometimes just relational needy where we can cling to relationships, not because we genuinely love the person, but we need that to validate and fill us up. We need that friendship to feel important. We need that relationship to feel secure. Those are relational neediness. And of course, there's financial neediness. But by this, in one sense, I don't mean feeling poor, because so many people can be so rich and yet still feel so needy. Like it's never quite enough, and still anxious, and check the accounts and refresh the portfolios and calculate whether it will be enough. And even if the number grows, the insecurity grows too. Because if we're honest, the number's never what's going to really fix what's calling and what's broken inside. And of course, there's a spiritual type of neediness, which sounds like virtue, but isn't always, because sometimes spiritually, like we need the next whiz bang, we need the next conference, we need the next book, we need the next insight. We're just restless and try and go from one high point to another, where we're continually looking for something we actually already have, looking for a satisfaction that's already been given. Struck reading this week in John 13, where 13 and 14, where Jesus, in his last night, where he's preparing the disciples, he's telling them he's about to go away. He says, don't let your heart be troubled. And each of the disciples give these different objections. And finally, Philip just says, look, all we want is to see the Father. Just show us the Father. And Jesus says, have I been with you so long that you have seen the Father through me the whole time? The greatest living demonstration and embodiment of the Father has been around you for the last 3 years, and you've missed it. You haven't seen it. The thing you're asking for has been given to you the entire time. I just wonder how much spiritually, if we wonder, like, what if the thing you've been longing for and asking for has already been given? You just can't see it yet. And so there's a spiritual type of neediness. See, if Christ is truly enough, then one of the questions is then why are we still so hungry? This reminds me of one of the books we read as a staff last year, which was one of Cynthia's favorite books of the year. It's called How to Know a Person by David Brooks. And he has these two framing things where he talks about diminishers versus illuminators. He says diminishers are the type of people who make you feel smaller, unseen, drained. They're kind of like a relational kind of black hole that just kind of suck things in. But illuminators, they're the type of people who bring light, attention, life to others. You all know what it's like to be around someone and feel drained, and then be around someone and have generative life. And what I think we're seeing here is in Acts 4 is painting a picture of a whole community of illuminators who are illuminating. Why? How can they do it? It's because grace has freed them from the need to be at the center. The security of the resurrection has freed them from needing constant affirmation. All of God and the Son has freed them from needing to manage their own image. Now, unfortunately, we'll see in 5, 6, and 7, it doesn't last very long. But at least they get a moment of it. All those forms of neediness I just mentioned, they're all rooted in things like insecurity of identity, lack of a settled presence and love, absence of deep assurance. So people grasp for affirmation, control, protect image, and unintentionally wound others because they're trying to get from people what only Christ can truly give. So when we think about this dynamic, I don't want you to walk away, okay, I don't want to be that kind of needy. I don't want to be the diminisher. So I have to become less needy. That's not quite that's good, but it's not quite what I think the gospel would press in on it. Because the goal isn't to be less needy. The goal is to be so filled with Christ that your neediness no longer controls your relationships. The goal is to be a part of a gospel-shaped community where people still have needs, but they're no longer ruled by those needs and then burden others with them. So how does a grace-saturated culture, what does it look like? So you can kind of contrast. In a needy culture, people take more than they give. Conversations revolve around the self, and others feel drained, cautious, and guarded. But in a grace-saturated culture, people are secure enough to be open-hearted and open-handed. They're aware of others' needs. They're quick to serve. They're slow to demand. And they're relationally safe and generous. These are the two dynamics. So the early church didn't have less need. They just had so much grace, it covered all the needs. So when Christ is truly present, people stop becoming drains on the community and becoming channels of grace. So we're going to stop at point 2. So point 3, the great fear, we're going to start unpacking the next couple weeks as we look how Satan goes on the attack to the church. And he attacks them and says, Satan filled their heart to lie. And then we have hearts that are filled with jealousy. And then grumbling and complaining are coming. So we're going to look at in essence, the spiritual warfare that we're in. But we're going to pause here and stop this morning on point 2. And here's kind of the invitation. If you find yourself where you're chronically needy, emotionally, relationally, financially, spiritually, the answer is not to try harder to be content. Often contentment is not something we can kind of manufacture. It is something we learn, but part of the learning is we receive. Here Paul says in Philippians, I have learned the secret of what it means to be content. So I've learned this. It's not natural. The way we start out as infants, self-centered, needy, demanding the entire world stop the moment we feel hunger pains, that's how we start out into the world. But the goal is to learn this type of contentment. So how did Paul learn it? Well, he learned it through understanding that I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. You know, it's one of the most quoted verses in America that you see on many football players' eyeline. And okay, that's, great. You can make that tackle through Christ. But really the context is I can learn, whether in plenty or in want, with much or little, I can learn contentment. I mean, you talk about a modern American miracle. People ask, well, where are the miracles that we used to see in the early church now? We don't see those now. Well, let's talk about a miracle you want to see. Learning how to be content with what you already have. And he says, I have learned the secret to be content. And where does that knowledge comes from? It comes from knowing the resurrected Christ. I've been united to him. He didn't just know it in his head. He knew it in his bones. He knew Christ was his inheritance, his portion. He could say with the psalmist, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. It's not that I don't have any more wants or don't have any desires. It's that he is my shepherd, so I am settled. And so when that settles in on you, you don't have to work up the generosity. You don't have to be manipulated into being open and free because you are full. And once you are full, you become free. And you can see this. You can see it in just the world. Have you ever noticed, so our boys went to a birthday party yesterday, and it was a soccer party, so they played soccer for several hours, and then they broke out the pizza and the birthday cake. And it was like locusts swarming the pizza and the cake. And that's not just because they're all ravenous. They're all empty. But you kind of bring it up, you offer the pizza and the cake to the adults, and we haven't done a whole lot of activity. We're just kind of sitting there. We've been snacking the whole time. And it's a lot easier to kind of say no or be generous when you're already full. And one of the things is just so much easier, in essence, to be generous when you're already full. So what fills us? We have to be filled by the Spirit, filled by the Son. Generous people don't have less needs. They're just full of grace. And that's what great grace is. It's not theoretical. It's relational. It's not abstract. It's visible. Great grace shows up in contentment. Great grace shows up in generosity. Great grace shows up in a community where there's no needy person among them. So what would it be like to be filled with a room of greatness? One of the kind of funny things about our modern celebrity is modern, celebrities, they almost become like an attention, I don't know, vortex. That's not the right. Where Nick need to tell me the right like black hole. They're like this vortex where all the energy just gets sucked into them. So for example, if Justin Bieber walked into this room and just wanted to sit in the back, I would lose all of you. Nobody would pay attention. I mean, it's Justin Bieber, but nobody would pay attention to a single word I had to say because all of the energy and the attention would then be sucked up with wherever he was sitting. And in our world, that's what we call greatness. But in this world, what is greatness? Well, I wonder what it'd be like if you walked into a room and instead of pulling all the attention towards yourself, you quietly reduced all the needs around you. And that was true greatness. True greatness was you quietly illuminated the world and the people around you. So final call, are we needy? Are we clinging? Where in your life are you still trying to get from people or from money or from achievement or from approval only the things that Christ can give? And so here's the invitation. Come to him. Not later, not when you've fixed yourself, not when you've determined not to be needy, but come hungry, come empty, because he's the bread of life. And we come to be filled. And so we stop trying to fill ourselves with things that ultimately can't fill us and entrust ourselves to him. We come to him to receive great power and great grace. One of the reasons we come to the table every week is because it's kind of our symbolic way of we're going to come to the table and symbolically be filled with his body and his blood, the power of his presence. Remember, David celebrates, at your right hand is the fullness of joy. So we come into him, we come to his presence. So in just a moment, I'm going to pray for us, and we're going to have 4 servers when they're in place, 2 in the front, 2 in the back. 1 in the back corner will be gluten-free. And one of the reasons we're coming to the table. As you come this week, I want you to think and ask and pray the Lord. Say, when I just take this, it's just taking a taste. But what this is meant to spiritually symbolize is that we need to be filled by his presence, by his body, by his life, his word. So Lord, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the risen Christ who has said, whoever is thirsty, to come to me and drink. And you will fill them in such a way that out of their heart, living waters will flow. So we confess that we are thirsty. We confess that we live in a dry and weary land. A land, even though it's filled with incredible material abundance, we know that ultimately those material things can't satisfy the deepest thirst of our souls. So we ask that you help us to be these kind of people. Help us to not be needy in all of the self-centered destructive ways, but to be needy in all of the dependent ways where we're dependent and needy on you for mercy, on you for grace, on you for love. Fill us with that so that we can then reflect it to those around us. In your name I pray. Amen.